reform the GRA so we can get to other issues that matter to the trans community. Thank you.
Joanna Cherry.
I make reference to my entry in the Register of Interests, where I'm listed as a member of the advisory group of the not-for-profit organisation Sex Matters, and I'm also a supporter of the Lesbian, Gay and Bisexual Alliance, and proud to be so. The Honourable Member for Plymouth, Sutton and Devonport says that he's a massive gay. Well, I'm a massive lesbian, rather more massive than I was in my younger years. But anyway, I want to challenge everyone who said in this debate this afternoon that they want a respectful debate on reform of the GRA. And I want to challenge them to live up to their words and listen to the concerns that are held by many women and same-sex attracted people about the dangers of conflating sex with gender. Like them, I share the view that the introduction of self-identification of sex would negatively impact on existing provisions under the Equalities Act, and that this view is valid and well-founded, has been supported by the recent intervention of the Equality and Human Rights Commission. Their concerns centre on the potential consequences for individuals and society of extending the ability to change legal sex from a small defined group who've demonstrated their commitment and ability to live in their acquired gender to a much wider group who identify as the opposite gender at a given point. So it is not a modest reform. It's a reform with potential consequences, including those relating to the collection and use of data, the participation and drug testing in competitive sport, measures to address discrimination barriers facing women, and practices within the criminal justice system. Now, reform of the Gender Recognition Act is proposed in Scotland and supported by my party. And last year, our manifesto for the Scottish election said that we would work with trans people, women, equality groups, legal and human rights experts to identify the best and most effective way to improve and simplify the process by which a trans person can obtain legal recognition so that the trauma with that process is reduced. And our manifesto also said that we will ensure that these changes do not affect the rights or protections that women currently have under the Equality Act. And I was content to support that policy, which did not commit the SNP to a policy of self-ID. And what I have to say today is in line with my party's promise to work with women, equality groups, legal and human rights experts, and to ensure that reforms to the GRA don't affect the rights or protections that women currently have under the Equality Act. Now, under the Equality Act, there are a number of protected characteristics, and they include sex, sexual orientation, belief, which we now know, thanks to the Employment Appeal Tribunal, includes gender-critical beliefs, such as I hold. And the Equality Act also protects people who are at any stage of a personal journey of transition, or indeed de-transition. And so widely accepted are those protected characteristics that when my party were trying to win the independence referendum in Scotland in 2014, our current First Minister and then Deputy First Minister produced a draft constitution for an independent Scotland which would have enshrined those personal characteristics in the fundamental law of an independent Scotland alongside the human rights protected by the ECHR. Now, I just want to correct something that the Honourable Member for Brighton Kemptown said. There are laws about who can use which toilet. Under the and women shouldn't be expected to share their intimate spaces with men. Under the Equality Act, security staff and school supervisors, etc., are allowed to set and enforce single-sex rules. The Equality Act exceptions allow that. It's not a matter of criminal law, it's a matter of the civil law. So it's important to be clear about these things. Because if we lose clarity over what the words male and female mean, it will make it more difficult to set and enforce clear and simple rules for female-only services and women's sports. Now, some people have been very critical of the Equalities and Human Rights Commission for seeming to have modified their position on self-identification for trans people and reform of the Gender Recognition Act. But Baroness Falkner has been very clear that they have done so because new evidence about the tension between trans and women's rights has emerged. And I would remind those who've sought to impugn the Equality and Human Rights Commission and Baroness Falkner that her appointment was unanimously approved by the Women and Equalities Committee and the Joint Committee of Human Rights after an evidential hearing in this Parliament. So there is ample evidence that the concerns of the Equality and Human Rights Commission are well-founded. And in fact, only last week, in Scotland, we had two major legal decisions seemingly in conflict about the meaning of sex in law. Fortunately, because of the appellate system, we know that the appellate court's decision will take precedence. And the appellate court in Scotland was very clear that as our current law stands under the Equality Act, sex is not interchangeable with gender. There's a protected characteristic of sex, but there's not one of gender. There is a protected characteristic of gender reassignment. But the appeal court in Scotland was very clear that sex means male or female in law based on biological sex. That's the highest interpretation we have of the Equality Act in our law at present. So the word woman in the Equality Act doesn't include males who self-identify as women. Now, to find out what the general populace think about self-ID, we can look at some recent polling. And we've had two big opinion polls in Scotland in the last month and also a BBC survey, which have shown that while the majority of Scots support equal rights for trans people, as for the avoidance of doubt, do I, they are unhappy about the implications of a system of self-ID of sex without a gatekeeper. Not because it will discriminate against trans people, but because it opens up self-identification of sex to anyone, to a much wider group than trans people. Now, many of the groups, like LGB Alliance, who've tried to promote a respectful dialogue in relation to these matters, have not had the sort of reception that the Honourable Member for Carshalton and Wallington has suggested they should, and they've been vilified, sometimes by members of this House, and that's not right.
Hear, hear.
We need to have a respectful debate. By all means, let's reform the 2004 Act, but let's do it in a way that respects the protected characteristics that are enshrined in our Equality Act and takes into account the legitimate concerns of many women and same-sex attracted people. Thank you.
Hear, hear.